Welcome to a new segment of the ADM+S podcast, where we're bringing our researchers to the spotlight to discuss how AI and ADM technologies are impacting our day-to-day lives, based on recent research by members at the centre. Today, we're going to be learning about behavioural insurance with Dr. Jathan Sadowski and Dr. Kelly Lewis, co-authors, along with Dr. Zofia Bednarz, of a recent article titled Risk, Value, Vitality, the Moral Economy of a Global Behavioural Insurance Platform. Kelly and Jathan, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us. Very excited to talk about this.
Well, I'm going to pass straight over to you guys if you'd like to give a brief introduction and your research background. Jathan.
Sure. So I am an associate investigator here with the center, but also a senior research fellow at the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University, where I work on the political economy of insurance technology. So in part trying to think about how the insurance industry thinks about technology and risk and value and data and all of these kinds of, elements that we tend to think about automated decision-making or technology or digital systems in every other sector except insurance. Insurance is this weird sector that is ubiquitous in our lives, but not on our mind at all. And so my work is really trying to understand better like how the insurance industry is integrating with new technologies and bringing these capabilities into their practices of risk management.
Kelly.
Hi, well, I'm a research fellow in the Automated Decision Making and Society Centre and also in the Emerging Technologies Lab at Monash University. So my research kind of similar to Jathan's, but really kind of looks at the social, the cultural, the political and the economic implications of the various ways that our data is being collected, used and stored for various different purposes. And I also have kind of an increasing interest in thinking about like a lot of the harmful practices of the way that our data is actually being used, some of the discriminatory patterns that we can see, as well as other types of harmful patterns that come from predictive risk analysis and even things that go into things like automated decision-making, obviously around things like predatory targeting of advertising as well.
Very good. Well, today we're here to talk about behavioural insurance based off your recent paper. So what is behavioural insurance and what motivated you guys to write this paper?
Yeah, that's a great question. So behavioral insurance is it's very much a growing trend in the insurance industry that's focused on trying to figure out ways of capturing and using risk data about consumer behavior. So things like our everyday activities, our choices, our lifestyles, these elements that make up policyholders' whole life that have tended to be out of the realm of data capture and out of sight from insurance industry, right? Traditionally, insurers would have very minimal interaction with policyholders. It might be at the point when you're applying for a policy, a car insurance or home insurance or life insurance. It might be at the point at which you're trying to make a claim. You've had a car accident or you're going to the doctor or something like that. Or when you're renewing your insurance policy, usually every 12 months, right? So you've got these kind of big, major, but kind of scarce and widely spaced out kind of interaction points in a traditional insurance policy. Behavioral insurance is trying to figure out ways to multiply those interaction points, multiply the kinds of data that's collected, not just from a application questionnaire or a health assessment or an insurance claims adjuster coming and looking at your car or your home in the case of like a storm or something like that. And instead trying to see how are you actually living during your everyday life? What kind of choices are you making? What kind of activities are you engaged in? And how can that be a key source of value for insurers in terms of thinking about you as a risk object, right? If with behavioral insurance, we're seeing this much more around, car insurance and health and life insurance, which is really the topic of our paper. We're laying out a big case study of a major health and life insurer that is at the forefront of thinking about how to develop technologies and platforms and these incentive systems for capturing that data about people's everyday behaviors and valorizing it, creating some kind of value out of that can then be used for risk analysis, risk management, risk pricing, and all of these kinds of things that insurers tend to engage in.
Yeah, and I think, like Jathan said, traditionally a lot of the research in this space has sort of looked at the telematics devices within the car insurance model. So I think for us a really interesting point was to look at more kind of the wearable, personified kind of technologies and the way that they are being embedded in the insurance sector and the way that the data that they're harvesting is actually being used, which is still quite unclear to some extent, but the way that insurers are also thinking about that and the way that they're moralizing their use of that data. And then also we've been thinking critically about the harms, obviously, that come from that data use as well.
You've done a really good job at kind of explaining how this technically is playing out. What are some of the impacts on end users? How are we actually seeing this impact people who are using these systems or accessing these processes?
Yeah, so I think so to go off of what Kelly was saying around vehicle telematics, I think what are vehicle telematics, right? These are the kind of black box devices that are plugged into a car, or they might be sensors that are built directly into newer vehicles. So with connected cars that are really not, newer cars are not just computers on wheels. They're 1,000 computers all linked together with a bunch of sensors that are also on wheels and usually connected to the internet for over-the-air updates, or when you take them in to get your kind of annual servicing. That's when a lot of data that the car is collecting is then being downloaded and uploaded to manufacturers, who then go on to sell that data to risk analytics third parties. So data firms like LexisNexis that specialize in collecting this huge aggregate of data about people's cars and how they operate those cars, and then creating risk products, right? And so if we're thinking about what that means for downstream users, if you have a behavioral car insurance policy, which increasingly a lot of people have these kinds of policies, or they're rolled up into the terms and service that you agree to when you buy a new car, and you go through all these contracts, both paper contracts and digital contracts, and you're signing them and you're clicking agree on 100 different boxes so you can take your new car and use it. Wrapped up in those terms of service agreements are clauses around, this data is going to be shared with vehicle manufacturers, who will then go on to share or sell this data to trusted third parties. And those third parties are using that data to create risk products that then are being bought by insurance companies that then go on to directly impact people's insurance policies, their premium pricing. It creates driver scores for people. It can penalize or reward drivers based on their performance. And it's data around things like when you drive your car, right? What times of day do you drive your car and for how long? Do you drive them during the day? Do you drive it at rush hour on the highway? Do you drive it late at night? Insurers see these different times of day as having different risk profiles. Driving late at night is indicative of higher risk behavior versus driving, only on Sunday afternoons to the grocery store or something like that. It's also data around where you drive your car. So the kind of precise geospatial location of your vehicle. Are you driving it in, riskier neighborhoods or in safe neighborhoods? And as well, how you drive your car. So it's collecting data about so-called risk events. So these are things like hard braking, sharp turns, quick acceleration. That's the kind of data that your car is collecting about you anytime that you're driving it. If it's a newer car, the car itself is doing it. If it's not a newer car, then it's a black box device or it's a smartphone app that might be doing it. And then that whether people know it or not, this kind of data is then influencing decisions that insurers are making. And so that's what behavioral insurance kind of looks like in the car space.
Yeah, and then when we obviously progress that through to what we're looking at in the paper is really kind of like the health and life insurance aspect. It is moving to more the wearable kind of devices that have become habitual in our everyday life, where it's the Apple smartwatch or a Garmin device or a Fitbit, for example, that people also wear a bit like a lifestyle brand now. So it's become kind of a normal part of their everyday attire. So people don't really think so much about what is actually happening. So just like Jathan was sort of explaining with the telematics devices, that it is this kind of total surveillance of every action, every behaviour that you're doing as a driver. It's the same when you're wearing a wearable device. It's tracking your heart rate, it's tracking what your sleep metrics are, what you're eating if you're putting that data into it. So it gets this kind of total idea of your everyday behavioural habits, and it starts to make inferences about what type of person you are, how risky you are. So that gives a lot of granular detail, obviously, to an insurer. And what happens from that device is that information then flows on to different data centres, and it's shared in different forms to different partner networks. And then, that can be either in identifiable kind of personal information or non-personal information that may be shared in more aggregate form. But what happens is at every stage when you plug in to sign up for these insurance policies, it's consent by default. So your data is then going off to be used for various purposes, be that through pricing models, be that through product development, through kind of research and development of products as well as potentially downstream users by advertisers and partner networks for other means. So I think people are being bound up in this kind of total longitudinal way of thinking about what their behavioural habits are. And that's sold very much by the insurers as this kind of individualised way of presenting you with personified insurance. But what it actually does is place us into kind of data relations with one another, because that data flows from the individual to be pooled in kind of a collective. And so our individual data points then actually start to be grouped with other people that have similar behavioural traits like us, and then insurers can make predictions about groups of people, and then that could also give the basis of potential discrimination, or it allows kind of the segregation of markets for risk on who are the most desirable candidates to have type of policies being presented to them, or who might be priced out of the market because they're a little bit riskier.
And I think that really gets down to like the heart of a lot of this. A lot of these activities around creating ways of capturing this data and modeling it and analyzing it. It really is in a way creating methods for insurers to more precisely or differently like segment and segregate markets, right? So that they can find these kind of new vectors of discrimination, right? Rather than just discriminating on traditional means of like race or gender or postcode or whatever it might be, you can now also discriminate in an actuarial way based on, how often you go to the gym, how often you accelerate too quickly or brake too hard, if you're eating right, if you're sharing enough data with the insurers, right? Do you have this kind of like good data relationship of you're kind of constantly sending them data about your fitness, about your nutrition, about how you're driving, right? Which in their eyes is, saying, okay, good. Like this person has nothing to hide. They're sharing the kind of data that proves that they're a good person. And I think that kind of moral language of good person is very much part of this, as well, as Kelly was saying. And so thinking about that as a major part of the behavioral insurance trend, right? Creating these new vectors of discrimination, creating ways of segmenting the market. And then what that goes on to do, like what's the next step from there? On one hand, it's about trying to then like target the people that you deem are good risk. So you're kind of what's called cream skimming. You're trying to skim the cream from the top, get the people who are proven by their behaviors to be high value because they're low risk. They're less likely to make a claim or have, chronic health issues or get in a car accident based on their kind of actuarial behavioral profile. Those are the kinds of people as an insurer you want on your books, because they're going to be paying premiums and they're not going to be making claims. And then on the flip side of that is it becomes a way of distargeting people who are bad risk. How can you avoid or, insuring people who have risk profiles or behavioral profiles that indicate they might be more expensive. They might make more claims, or they act in erratic or unsafe ways. And so how can you avoid getting them on your books altogether, or find ways to kick them off your books? And then, we can go on from there with like our case study, which the case study of discovery vitality that we have is taking that even a step further. We're thinking about how to create systems that are based on this data, based on these forms of analysis, based on kind of incentive mechanisms built around behavioral economics, as a way to then actively try to change how people live, how they behave. So not just decide in some, supposedly objective sense, who's a good risk and who's a bad risk, but actually shift people from being bad risk to good risk.
I'm going to pick up on something you said before, because I think this comes up so often, even just in my job with like research translation and doing outreach for a multidisciplinary centre. It seems like a very common thing for organisations or industries to frame using technology in their services as a way to personify services or processes, but really it's doing the opposite. To what extent are these industries or organizations held accountable? Like we're using terms like surveillance and data collection. How does like the privacy and ethics come into this?
Yeah, I think particularly in the case of discovery and the vitality model that we've been looking at, it is complex when you look at the legal landscape around how these things are structured. So it very much depends on the kind of contractual relations and the jurisdictions of the laws. Of course, a company like Discovery Limited, it's a global operator, so it has to work across a lot of different kind of legal landscapes. In the context of Australia, Vitality is sold through AIA Australia. So the data that's actually taken from citizens within Australia is actually stored in 3 different servers, depending on what data that actually is. So the highly kind of personal data will be stored in data servers in Australia and in Hong Kong, where AI's group headquarters are. And then the non-personal data is actually then housed in servers in the United States, in Virginia. So they are compliant in terms of legal regulations, although what is less clear is how the data flows really work and what the problematics around that might actually be. So, for example, in Australian context, some forms of data like location data are not considered personal data, but in the US context, location data, is considered as personal data. So it's not kind of an even consistent legal landscape. So it makes it a bit unclear exactly what happens in those data flows and exactly when they are saying what it means that something's anonymized or de-identified. And again, the different kind of compliance between the GDPR, say in the European context, where Vitality operates out of the UK, versus the Australian, where we have obviously different data privacy laws in operation here versus the US. So they are being compliant across that level. But again, we don't really understand a lot about the level of those data flows, and that's not really made transparent back to consumers, because once they've given their consent for their data to be used, it's pretty much able to be used for any purpose that Discovery deems fit.
Yeah, and picking up on what Kelly said around, as far as we know, these companies are all compliant with with privacy and security laws, but that doesn't really get you very far, especially when we have a landscape of privacy and security laws that are so old and so outdated. Even if we think about something like the GDPR in Europe, which is really seen as among the gold standard of more contemporary kind of privacy and information security laws, it's not something from the 80s or from the 90s, as is the case with so many laws in Australia and in the US. Even then, it's extremely limited around its focus around kind of protecting human rights, right? Which is a very constrained way of understanding what the impacts or the importance of something like, data usage is. And then if we think about that in the insurance context as well, it's also a case where the insurance industry is an extremely regulated industry, but in extremely specific ways, right? And so there's a lot of regulations around what kind of information and data insurers can collect, how they can use that and process that information, but largely around questions of like underwriting, right? Which is only the kind of the front end, one aspect of a much larger value chain and a much more complex ecosystem. And so, when we might have constraints around insurers not being able to use specific kinds of data or only being able to use specific kind of data in their underwriting decisions. So underwriting in terms of thinking about like how they quote someone a policy or how they set a premium for a policy. But everything that follows after that, there's very little limitation in terms of the data that they can use to create kind of like marketing scores, right? So things that are like, well, this is not an underwriting score. This is a marketing score. It's used for these other purposes that are not directly impacting or influencing underwriting decisions, right? And so, but as we've just talked about, if you can create like really precise marketing scores, then that's going to give you a really powerful way of segmenting and segregating the market, of deciding who you're going to insure and who you're not going to insure, who even gets to that point of underwriting. And then after that, you can use this data for the kind of programs that we see Discovery Vitality use, which are these kind of point-based incentive programs that are not about underwriting, and it depends on the jurisdiction. In some places, like in the UK or in South Africa, where Discovery is based, but Discovery operates in every market around the world. In the UK, you can actually use the kind of data around from fitness wearables to directly provide discounts on people's premiums or to increase the price of people's premiums. In Australia, you can't do that, but what you can do is create lots of kind of in-kind things. So you're not providing a direct discount on someone's premium, but you're giving them, incentivizing them with gift cards to Woolies or to Dindy to see a movie, or, giving them rewards such as subsidizing the cost of an Apple Watch as long as you reach a certain point threshold and maintain a certain status in your insurance plan. But if you drop below that threshold or drop that status, then you have to pay back the payments on your Apple Watch that Vitality was picking up the tab on. And so you have all these ways that are not directly about underwriting. And I mean, similarly with like claims, the way that fraud detection works, and increasingly there's a lot of machine learning systems that are used to kind of automate the detection of fraud. So flagging people based on their data profile. You look like somebody who's doing fraud, which might impact you on the front end of, you're quoted a higher price, or you're not quoted a policy at all because they don't want to deal with you. Or on the back end, when you're filing a claim, that behavioral data about how you drive or how you exercise, and all of that can be included then directly into claims management and claims decisions, which, can be even more impactful than the underwriting decisions. Because if you get a favorable policy, but then you're never able to claim on it, there's no point in having the policy at all anyways. And so all that's to say is that I think what we see with this intersection between digital technologies and the insurance industry, two very, very complex segments, when you're thinking about them from the legal and policy standpoint, it becomes very clear how inadequate the laws are for both of them, how hyper-focused they are on specific segments of technology or specific segments of the insurance industry, while also leaving aside and leaving a ton of accountability gaps in every other aspect of the use of those technologies or in the insurance value chain.
And I was just going to add on to what Jathan said there as well. Like when we talk about data flows, we often talk about opacity, but that opacity is also embedded within the policy documents themselves for very good reasons. It's strategic. And when we think about the complications that presents for everyday consumers, when you read through the policy documents, it is very much like you are agreeing to give your consent for your data to be used. But if you actually want to understand your data journey, this is where the opacity becomes pretty prevalent. So if you read through the various documents that are attached to Vitality's products for consumers in Australia, there are some documents that you could say are policy light. So there may be a 2-pager that are designed to be a quick read through of essentially what is this product, what's our responsibility. Compliance is still meeting compliance here by saying what the responsibility is to the consumer and how your data is used, etc. But then you have to there's always a small bit of print that says to understand how this may be used with third parties, you have to go onto another document. And then you actually have to follow a trail of documents to actually understand. And they are designed with intent to be this complicated because they want the consumer to lose interest and just be like, that's too hard. And it does become really complicated. And you see the language shift across the documents as well. So it is incredibly difficult for the average consumer to actually understand what data is being collected, how is it being stored, how is it being used, who has access to it, and how does that work across different jurisdictions? For example, in the European context, what about the right to be forgotten? What happens when your data is then caught up in aggregated data sets? How does that work? How do you get your data back? So it's incredibly complex. So while it might be compliant, it is highly opaque.
Something I could have asked at the top of the episode is obviously this paper is kind of based on a case study, but how widespread is this strategy across the industry in Australia at the moment?
Yeah, so we're based on the case study of Discovery Limited and the kind of Vitality program that they've created. And so, I mean, just as a quick background, right? Like, you know, we've been talking about Discovery Vitality. Discovery Limited is a financial services institution that does insurance, but also does banking and other kind of financial services that's based in South Africa. But it operates globally, and especially through this Vitality program it's created, which is a program that's at the forefront of creating the kind of platforms and marketing and the whole philosophy around behavioral insurance for life and health insurance in particular, which they then license the intellectual property of this Vitality program with major insurers that operate in markets around the world. I think they've captured 40 markets in every region around the world through partnerships with major insurers. In Australasia, it's through AIA that they partner with. And so our case study is of Vitality because they were one of the first movers in the industry in terms of thinking about how can we use behavioral data to not only affect our pricing and our marketing of policyholders, but also to try to affect behavioral change in consumers. And then, you know, they started doing this even like in the late 90s is when they started trying to think about ways of doing this, long before a lot of the wearable technologies and digital technologies that are now integral to those programs even existed. So they've been laying the groundwork for this for a long time. And in terms of how prevalent these kinds of approaches of behavioral insurance are in Australia, it's very much a trend that's growing very rapidly, in large part because seeing the success of it with companies like Vitality, who were first movers, all of the major insurers around the world that are partnering with Vitality and promoting the Vitality program as something that's very beneficial for the insurance industry, but also part of our research is around the kind of moral economy of this. So how they construct this kind of very moralistic language of the value of this kind of behavioral tracking and behavioral personalization and everything as something that is also valuable for individuals because it's going to make you healthier, happier, and all of that. But also for society, right? It's going to increase the general welfare of society by actively changing people's behavior to make them, healthier, to make them drive safer, or whatever it might be. I think a big part of why behavioral insurance as a trend is really starting to take off now is also largely because it's insurers reacting to technological innovations and trends that are happening in other segments of the economy. It's when insurance companies look at digital platforms like Meta or like Google or Amazon, some of the richest companies in the world, and they see that those companies are built on capturing data, surveilling people, and finding ways to monetize that data for targeting, for advertising, for whatever it might be. Other companies are going to look at that and say, how can we get a piece of that pie? What can we do to change the way that we operate so that it's more in line with this kind of like technological capitalism, this kind of surveillance capitalism, or this idea of, data capture or automated decision making or machine learning as these real kind of, sources of untapped value in the economy. And so with that, we see with the insurtech sector, so insurance technology, this sector is interesting because while there are startups, there are absolutely startups that are doing things like behavioral car insurance, the kind of pay as you go or pay as you drive, as it's called. There are startups in Australia doing this. There are home insurance startups that are collecting data about people and how they live in their houses. There are, there are startups that are in this space, but I think what's most interesting about insurtech is it's not really a market that's defined by these kind of upstart disruptors, people who are coming in and saying, we're going to disrupt this industry with new technologies. That was what people thought were going to happen early in the kind of insurtech market. But very quickly, what happened is that it's the very large incumbents who are either acquiring these startups or building their own internal startup accelerators and internal corporate venture capital funds, their own internal kind of research and development and innovation teams that are thinking about how can we, as a major insurer that might have millions of policy holders, implement some of these technologies and some of these systems into our products, whether that might be a full-on behavioral product like pay as you drive, which is literally based on you pay based on how much you drive and how you drive, and all of that data is fed directly into your policy, or implementing these kinds of systems in a kind of more background way into just normal policies, which is, I think, a lot of what we see right now with, especially if we're thinking about like the behavioral car insurance. There's been some really great reporting in the by the New York Times recently in the American context, but I think we can extrapolate to other contexts showing that this is happening in these kind of backdoor ways where people don't know that their car is collecting all that behavioral data about them. They don't know that the vehicle manufacturers are capturing that data, selling it to third parties who are then selling risk products based on that data to insurers, which then come back around and affect people's insurance. They don't know this because it's happening in these really kind of deceptive ways. It's smuggled in policies and terms and conditions. And as the New York Times showed as well, it's oftentimes people are not themselves agreeing to these things. If you go to a car dealer, the dealers themselves, the car salespeople themselves are incentivized by vehicle manufacturers to sign a specific quota of people up to these kind of data collection programs that the vehicle manufacturers have. And so when you're going and buying a new car, rather than you yourself having the opportunity to click the box that opts you into sharing your data with the vehicle manufacturer, the car salesperson is just going through and doing it all for you while they're talking to you. You know, they're just saving you the time with all these, all these buttons that you have to click and these things you have to agree to. And so what reporting has shown is that this may actually go, break the law because it's supposed to be the person themselves opting into a contract, whereas somebody else is doing it on their behalf without their knowledge. And so in terms of thinking about like how widespread this is in the insurance industry, we know from the marketing and from the products that it is very much a topic of great discussion and something that the insurance industry is very much trying to roll out in various different ways. But we also know from this kind of reporting that there is a kind of a subterranean view here where there's a lot of other stuff happening out of sight in terms of the insurance industry trying to adopt these practices and take advantage of this form of behavioral surveillance and automated decision making.
And I'll just quickly add just a small point to that. I think thinking about how prevalent it is within Australia and globally, like the way to think about this is it's part of this wellness ecosystem, right? The way that it's kind of being modeled in the sense that it integrates a lot of different kind of actors or players, partners all together. So we've obviously been talking about the Vitality model, and we chose Vitality because it's the largest player. Like it even describes itself as the world's largest behavioural platform. So it really is a market leader. But of course, there are many other players within this market. But the kind of the ideology that is really behind that is this wellness industry that we're seeing. And so that integrates insurers, governments, health providers, technology partners, like a whole kind of ecosystems of partners that are tied up in that network. And it's sold to society, right? It's just sold to kind of the individual and the insurers as being this kind of win-win narrative as well. And it's sold into governmental health policies as being a win-win narrative, because if we collect all this data, we can produce behavioural change, then that's going to result in less cost for insurers because we'll have decreased risk around health and behavioural aspects that could lead to undesirable outcomes. It means that employers are going to benefit through kind of corporate insurance programs when their employees are more productive, more healthy, more well. The individual's going to benefit because they're going to understand their health a lot better. They're going to be able to tailor a longer, healthier life. And society benefits because we will become much more productive and healthier as a result. So it's this win-win narrative that's really sold to us and the ideology that's really driving this. And you can start to see what this wellness kind of ecosystem looks like at a global level. It's hugely profitable.
So what you're saying is there's no escaping it and everyone knows everything about you. Pretty much.
Well, not to have the kind of inevitabilism and kind of this nihilism of there's no escaping it. I mean, it is very much, in my work, I've called it total life insurance, right? Which is this kind of this logic, this desire to have this kind of totalizing view of a person's entire life and be there and have this kind of actuarial regime of governance powered by technology that's there at every step of the way, kind of, assessing your risk, actively managing that risk, and taking account of that risk in their own kind of decisions around pricing and policies and claims and stuff. But I think importantly, there's always this question of how far down the track are we really, right? And I think this is something that we talk a lot about in the paper too, which is this disconnect between the kind of the ideals and the values and the logics and the goals that are driving the development of insurance technology or behavioral insurance or these kinds of systems of actuarial risk governance. The disconnect between those goals and where we are actually in terms of like the material reality of them. Because like with Discovery Vitality as a case study is also extremely instructive here in that regard, because as we've argued in our paper and as other group of scholars in Europe who have researched behavioral insurance, Ginny Gross and McFall, who we cite in the paper as well. Like we're all arguing that a huge part of the behavioral insurance product is its branding value, right? It is its value of kind of branding themselves as innovative, as at the forefront, as delivering a kind of win-win for everybody. A way of branding the insurance industry is not just one of the most hated and most distrusted industries in the world, which insurance always ranks at the top of these surveys of like the companies people trust less or the most hated industry. And so they're very like self-aware of that kind of image that they have. And so doing partnerships with Apple Watch, or doing partnerships with luxury vehicle manufacturers, or kind of doing partnerships with these other big brands that have much more favorable public opinion is a way as well of the insurance industry trying to change its own brand by saying we're not this industry that is just kind of never wants to interact with you, never thinks about you, never wants to pay out a claim or anything. We're actually more like a life partner. We're actually someone who's really invested in your life and in your wealth and your health and your all of this kind of stuff. And we're going to do it by being, really technologically forward and all of this, right? And you can have a more direct understanding of how your behavior impacts your insurance policy. It makes it this thing that, is supposed to be not as opaque, right? You can see, I went to the gym, 20 out of 30 days this month, and I got rewarded for it, so you can kind of start drawing these direct connections. But also, of course, like part of that is the branding, where there's a lot of skepticism about how effective these programs actually are in terms of like changing people's behavior, how effective they actually are at delivering any of the social goods that they claim to be, versus how much they are insurers using that data for other purposes, or, as is often the case, creating systems for capturing that data without actually having any clue how they're going to valorize it or monetize it or otherwise use it, just hoping that at some point in the future they figure out how to use these, as vitality claims. It has millions of life years of data about people from around the world. And so it's like, okay, what are you actually doing to create value out of that or to create products out of that right now, versus how is it, if that is that trove of data just kind of sitting there and you're hoping that some machine learning or AI innovation in the near future will crack the code of deriving value from that, right? And so I think that's a really important part, is like understanding that these are the values, these are the logics, these are the goals that are really pushing the industry, and we should be really critical of that, and we should be very knowledgeable of that, and we should address that, while also recognizing that they're not there yet. They're not at that point of like total life insurance. Much as they are pushing towards it and have been for the last 150 years, these ideas of like hyper-personalized risk pricing or super granular segmentation of markets, like, in my research, I've come across actuaries from over 100 years ago expressing these exact same kind of goals and saying at some point the industry will be able to have these like risk pools of one, kind of thing. And so I think what's important is understanding how that directly impacts the way technologies are designed, how they're developed, what technologies are invested in and what technologies are not invested in. And it is all about how the values and the visions of a private insurance industry is dictating the development of that technology. It's not that the technology is coming in from the outside and disrupting the industry, changing everything about its operations. It's that the values of the industry are influencing the technology, and understanding why and how that's happening, I think, is really crucial for putting us on a different pathway, right? Kind of detouring off the road that we're on, recognizing it's leading towards a destination that is probably not actually for our benefit or for social good or the public's welfare, but is instead toward the benefit of these kind of private interests and these massive corporations, and kind of, exiting off of that highway and putting ourselves in a different direction.
Yeah, and I think I'll just come back to the point you raised also, Nat, with, like, do they know everything about us, right? So I think it's important to think about the devices that are used to generate this data. And I think for organizations or corporates like Vitality, they are wanting that very highly granular, detailed information. And part of the value of that for them is using that within their research that they generate, right? Which is based on millions and millions of data points. And they really use that to advocate that their programs are actually working. Now, to what extent behavioural change is actually happening through the wearable devices is really debatable. Now, one of the major things we need to consider is how fallible these devices actually are. They could be considered poor quality data, right? So yes, we might be wearing them all the time, but how often do they get the metrics incorrect? There's been numerous literature written about the ineffectiveness of wearable tech, and they're not medical devices, right? So we have to be really critical about what we can actually say from the data that is being generated. So I think we always need to have that critical eye, but I think another point of really interesting concern is that the wearable devices we have are increasing all the time in what data and the granularity of that data that they can actually collect. And so it's even interesting when we were reading some of the policy information on AI Vitality in Australia, it stipulates that it is collecting particular device level information from the Apple Watch. But the metrics, in the Series 9, for example, actually collects or is able to generate more data than the Series 8. So it's unclear whether Vitality is actually capturing all that additional data or just the data they're saying. So it can take like your menstrual cycle, for example, your heat body, a regular heartbeat. So there's all these extra things that it's not really clear if it's actually capturing all that additional data as well. So again, there's level of opacity that comes to that. And again, when we think about the inaccuracy of these devices, how often do we wear them? How often do they miss a beat? They go flat, they do things. So if you're banking on that data being so credible, how are all the discrepancies are kind of accounted for in that as well?
Yeah, which really gets to a point there as well about like all data is up for interpretation. Like data doesn't actually speak for itself. It requires us to tell stories about that data. And so I think that's also a really key thing here is who gets to tell a story about data that's captured about our lives, right? Is it me? Can I tell a story about my wearable data, about my driving behavior or anything like that? No, I'm not really given an opportunity to tell that data. My only role is to produce that data. It's the insurance companies that are then in a position to interpret and tell a story about that data. And all stories are value-laden, right? They're going to tell stories that are aligned with their own interest, aligned with their own goals. And maybe if you're lucky, there's a kind of a Venn diagram that sits in the middle where, you kind of also partly align with their interests and their goals. But I think more often than not, there's a real disconnect between those interests and those goals. And so that is also really key here, as much as like the insurance industry, and by Vitality touts this in its marketing, that this is a science-backed program, right? That it's based on scientific studies and literature and reports that they've commissioned from independent third parties like RAND Corporation and stuff. That is also a story, right? That's a story about saying that we're an industry that's based on actuarial science and good, rigorous technical practices. But that's also part of being able to tell a story about your technology, about your data, and tell a story that is aligned with your own values. Because if it's not, you wouldn't tell the story.
Well, my key takeaway from today will be that if the insurance industry can rebrand itself, anyone can. So you've inspired me. I've got one last question, and I'm hoping you can maybe cover this quickly, but I feel like working in insurtech or being in this area of research, we'll be able to speak to this question quite well. We've talked a lot about value, and obviously these strategies or these incentives are largely profit driven, but we're talking about value in terms of consumer data and data collection. Where do you see that balance?
I think that one's a hard one to answer, like value for whom, right? So I think if we're thinking about, I'll take it from the consumer perspective. I think there's very little value for the consumer. I think it's sold to you that there is a high level of value, right? That's kind of the buy-in, whether that being from insurers or, other industries, the way that they are collecting data all the time is that whether and how you're incentivized to participate within those kind of markets as well. But I think, what we actually get back as consumers is of very little value when you think about it, whether it's in like frequent flyer reward programs or insurance products, you don't really get much back. You're giving a lot off. And yeah, a lot of that data can come back to actually discriminate against you in ways that you may not have foreseen at all.
Yeah. There's a real kind of consolation prize aspect, right? It's like you give all this data to all these countless known and unknown entities who are interested in capturing it. In return, you maybe get some like additional convenience or personalization in your products for your life. And, that's the disconnect there between that as a little bit of additional, added convenience or a little bit of added personalization is nowhere near compared to the value that data does and could potentially generate for larger institutions. Because I think that's also key here is that like for us as consumers, when we're thinking about what's the value of this data, we are of course thinking about what's the value of the data for me. It's a very individualized kind of way of understanding it. But data is not really valuable unless it's understood and captured in big aggregate forms that are in relational databases. So you can relate not just data about me, but also relate that to data about Kelly, about Natalie, about people we have no idea even exist, put all that together and find these interesting connections or correlations, associations, and then that's where the real value of that data comes from, not from the individual data point, but the connections between lots and lots and lots of data points. But that's not how we understand the value. That's not how we're given the value, which is why all we get is a little bit of convenience, a little bit of personalization, whereas companies get the ability to build multi-billion-dollar, trillion-dollar industries off of it, right? And so there's a huge disconnect there. But I think crucially, when I think about the insurance industry and its role in this, I also think about it as this kind of perverting force as well, because like all of that data about people's health could be extremely valuable at a societal level. This is the kind of promise behind biobanks, right? That are collecting lots of very personal data about people, health data, genetic data, and using that as a huge repository for what's supposed to be socially beneficial purposes of finding, new ways to diagnose and treat diseases, for example, or, whatever it might be. And I think, when we think about the collection of that kind of data, we're always a little reticent, not because of the data itself, but because of who might have access to it or what purposes, unintended or intended, primary or secondary, what purposes it might be put towards that pervert the promise of that actual real societal benefit of it. And so I think about like, very recently, machine learning researchers in the UK developed a model that they claim can very accurately predict the symptoms for Parkinson's disease, like years and years before people actually exhibit any symptoms that can be diagnosed in a clinical context based on Apple Watch data. So kind of motion sensor data from Apple Watches combined with data from the UK Biobank. And so this could be a really, really powerful diagnostic tool for clinical context to capture Parkinson's disease long before people are actually exhibiting symptoms to it, right? But that research was done in partnership with Apple Watch, with Apple. And we know who also has a long-standing partnership with Apple is Vitality, right? A health and life insurer, right? And so now all of a sudden, are worried, I think rightfully so, that is an insurance company going to use that machine learning model and use that data from the Apple Watch to predict that I'm at high risk of Parkinson's disease, years before I exhibit any symptoms, and then start treating me accordingly as high risk for a disease that I may or may not get and am not currently exhibiting any symptoms of? That I think is that kind of perverting force of like what the real value of this data is, who it's valuable for, but also how it could be valuable if you didn't have other institutions, other values kind of perverting it.
That's such a fascinating example, drawing that tie between what they're doing, but really it's all kind of creating the same impact. I think that draws our conversation to a close, unless you guys had anything extra that you wanted to add in.
No, I think that's it.
No, I think we were pretty comprehensive.
Well, thank you so much for taking part in this conversation. It's been lovely to chat to you both, and you can find their recent research paper linked below.